Name me a Korean gang. Any gang. I'll give you a second. You probably couldn't actually think of any, could you? But if I say to you, name me an Asian gang, you're more likely to say something like the Yakuza or the Triads. But what about Korea? Well, today we're going to look into the history of gangpe, or gangster or thug when translated from Korean. It's very interesting that Koreans don't get as much notoriety as either the Yakuza or the Triads, because Korean gangs go back very, very far. Not that I'm implying that gangs should be well recognized, but what I mean is that Korean gangster movies are actually one of the most popular genres of either movie or drama here in Korea. Think of 신세계, or The New World in English, or the Bomjae Doshi series, or The Outlaws in English, as well as dramas such as The General's Son. Korean gangs are likely to have existed way before we can even record them. However, in today's video, we're going to break them down into 4 eras. 1. The Japanese colonial era, between the years of 1910 to 1945. 2. The Isunman era, which was in the 1950s and early 1960s. 3rd. The Civil War era. This was under dictators such as Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. And of course, the modern day era up until now. We know that modern day Korean gangs deal with a lot of crime similar to the Yakuza or the Triads. But what if I told you Korea's first recorded gang was absolutely necessary for the history of Korea? And in fact, they might not even be looked at as a gang anyway. To understand more, we have to go back to the Japanese colonial period. This was a time for oppression for Koreans, one of the darkest times in Korean history. The oppression from the Japanese is something that the Korean history books will never ever forget. But to get a grasp of our first gangsters, we have to talk a little bit about the Yakuza. Now, the Yakuza was said to have started in the 17th century, and during the Japanese colonization, they brought their work to Korea. Not only did Koreans have to worry about the Japanese colonization and the rule of government, but also they had to worry on the street level with the Yakuza taking over most of the streets in Seoul. There were disgraceful acts from the government, and there were also terrible attacks from the Yakuza. The Yakuza would do things such as prostitution, smuggling goods in and out of Korea, as well as driving farmers out of their land. This would lead farmers into Seoul, which at the time was very poor and full of homeless people already. It was around that time as well that a lot of Koreans moved to Japan and migrated there to stop the oppression from happening in their own country. However, this also happened in Japan as well. First, let's look at Kim Doo-hwan, a figure associated with gangs, but also a freedom fighter for Korea, a person who was strongly against the Japanese oppression. Could we call him an anti-hero or a vigilante? The infamous or famous Kim Doo-hwan was not Korea's first gangster or mobster, but definitely one of the most notable to go down in history. Kim was born in 1918 and was the son of a well-known freedom fighter by the name of Kim Jwa-jin, a Korean general who served an important role in the development of anarchism in Korea. After Kim Jwa-jin and his wife were killed in 1930, Kim Doo-hwan was left on his own. Kim Doo-hwan would have only been about 12 years old at the time, and was basically thrusted out onto the streets of Seoul to look after himself. Given the poverty that Seoul was drowning in, Kim Doo-hwan had no other choice but to become a beggar and a fighter, and soon found a home in a Seoul Jongno gang called Jumok or Fist. He joined the gang through a well-known street hoodlum who was said to be one of the top Korean gangsters at the time, Kim Gi-hwan. Now, Kim Gi-hwan was the manager and owner of a very famous theatre in Seoul called the Yumikan Theatre, a place where no doubt he would have been doing a lot of his business from. Kim Doo-hwan was first employed there as a snack bar manager. However, when Kim Gi-hwan saw the potential in Kim Doo-hwan, then he moved him up into the gang. Now, I'm just speculating here, but I think the name of the gang, Jumok, is reference to the fact that in the old days, a lot of Koreans would only fight with their hands and not weapons. This was something that was spread throughout all of Seoul and Korea, and no gangs at the time would break those sort of rules. Now, Kim Doo-hwan would fight his way all the way to the top, and is said to have been one of the greatest fist fighters in Korean history. According to sources, Kim Do-han later formed his own gang around the age of 17 years old, called the Yumikan Gang. This was obviously named after his predecessor, Kim Gi-hwan's Yumikan Theatre. Ultimately, to do better against the Japanese colonial rule and have at least some power back in Seoul, Kim Do-han crushed other Korean gangs that were around at the time. He basically became the boss of all gangs, even taking over Kim Gi-hwan's gang after Kim Gi-hwan was arrested in 1935. Kim Do-han had full control over Jongno and was looking to expand his gang even further. Korea being the war-stricken country that it was at the time meant there were a lot of displaced families, as well as families that decided to migrate to Japan, as I mentioned earlier. If you watch the drama or read the book Pachinko, you will understand that some Koreans actually went to Japan for a better life from as early as 1915 to even 1989. Korean immigrant families there still face discrimination and hardships all round, and this forced many Koreans to turn to crime, just as a means to make a living, but also to fight their way against discrimination. Therefore, many Koreans actually turned to the Yakuza. Enter Hayashi. Hayashi was born in 1909 in Taedong, Korea, and his family was one of the families that moved to Japan when Hayashi was just 5 years old. Sources say when Hayashi was at working age, he started in the construction industry, a sector heavily influenced by the Yakuza. Now, while working for the construction industry, he was noticed by one of the top guys in the Yakuza, Toyama Mitsuru. It was said that the Yakuza and Mitsuru were so powerful that they had influence in Japan's entry into World War II. Toyama Mitsuru is a whole video in itself, and for that I recommend the channel Aneki to watch the full description of Mitsuru. Hayashi quickly moved through the ranks of the Yakuza, under the watchful eye of Mitsuru, and was considered Mitsuru's right-hand man. Given Hayashi's background, he was then sent to South Korea to take care of a branch in Seoul. It was said that Hayashi, though now deep in the roots of the Yakuza, was against imperialism. This could be due to his Korean roots. However, he wasn't there to oppress any Koreans. He was there to do business with the Yakuza. Hayashi eventually gained control of 3 very important areas in Seoul: Myeongdong, Uljiro, and Chungmuro. His main source of income came from adult entertainment, as well as opening stores for sub-bosses. Though he was a part of the Yakuza, he still had a lot of Koreans under him and working for him. Though Korean-born and anti-imperialistic, Hayashi still had problems with other Korean gangs. In particular, the Yumikan gang run by Kim Do-han. Previously, Hayashi and the Yakuza had little difficulty dealing with unorganized gangs in Korea, but now they had a real rival on their hands in the Yumikan gang. And not to mention that their territories were within arm's distance away from each other. These were the ingredients for a wider war. Hayashi held more land than Kim Do-han. However, through territorial skirmishes, Yumikan gang was able to hold their own. Sources say that Hayashi was well aware of Kim Do-han's fighting skills and employed a corrupt Japanese police officer to fight Kim Do-han. This Japanese police officer was called Man Maruka. Man Maruka had a reputation of being undefeated as a judo master. On paper, this should be an easy fight for Man Maruka. However, Kim Do-han beat the police officer and was crowned the best fist fighter in all of Korea at the time. Though Hayashi held most ground, it seemed that Kim Do-han was the one that always was one step ahead of Hayashi. These brawls would often happen between the Japanese and the Koreans. However, whenever the police got involved, and they were Japanese police, remember, the Japanese were never arrested and the Koreans were the only ones arrested. This would actually damage a lot of the Korean gangs, but it didn't stop Kim Do-han from doing his business. It was an interesting time in Korea. They needed a hero, but their hero also came in the form of a gang leader. But eventually, Korea got their liberation in 1945. After the liberation, many of the Yakuza went back to Japan, and from there, no Japanese gangs were influential in Korea anymore. Interestingly though, Hayashi decided to stay in Korea. With Hayashi still running his own businesses and now dropping down to the number 2 position in the pecking order of gangs, what's even more interesting is that once heated rival actually became a friendship in the end. Hayashi would even invest in Kim Do-han in his underground businesses. Now, Korea was still recovering both industrially and financially from the war. And now, Korea had also split into 2 countries, the North and the South. And this led to a whole new era of gangs. The Yumikan gang, now having great power in the city of Seoul, meant there were opportunities to push certain ideologies onto the public, and many gangsters, especially from the Yumikan gang, moved into politics. It seemed that although some of Kim Do-han's men were happy to serve under him, they weren't really interested in his political ideologies. So a lot of the gang left and moved on to the liberal side. With Kim Do-han being right-wing and his dissenters being ideologically on the left, Kim Do-han eventually formed his own right-wing political organization. However, it was still run like a gang. Kim Do-han would order attacks on left-wingers, making what was once gang warfare now a terrorist attack due to the political nature of violence. A man who was once called a hero has now solidified his name in government. A regime at the time known for anti-communist activism, paired with a man who ran the streets of Seoul, both now looked at the whole country as their playground. Kim Do-han would eventually become a politician in the Lee Seung-man Liberal Party. Despite it being called a Liberal Party, it was actually not that liberal at all. In fact, it was seen as a very anti-liberal, anti-communist, authoritarian, and nationalistic. In 1948, Kim Do-han murdered the leader of a communist party, presumably under Lee Seung-man's orders. He was sentenced to death by an American military tribunal. However, luckily for Kim Do-han, his case was handed over to a South Korean government and he was released from jail. I feel at this time I have focused too much on Kim Do-han. To be honest with you, there could be a whole episode just on Kim Do-han. But I have purposely concentrated on him as a peg to explain the origins of how Korean gangs started. So I will conclude with this. He was considered a hero by many, regardless of his affiliations, actions, etc. But then ultimately turned into an enemy when he moved into politics. It was during this period in the 1950s where gangs, though still active, were more involved within the government. And now we could go into the era of government-related gangs. But we also must not forget between the years of 1950 and 1953 was the Korean War. So I'm guessing that there weren't a lot of gang activities going around at the time. They were too busy with the war. I couldn't actually find too much information on the times between 1950 and 1953. But, like I said, I assume that they were too busy trying to fight for their own country. But if you know anything about the Korean War, you would know that North Korea came extremely close to taking over the whole country. This led to a lot of migrants, but in the end the two countries decided to split, and there are actually a lot of North Korean defectors as well. From what I researched, 3 gangs had immense power within Seoul. They were the Jongno gang, the Dongdaemun gang, and the Myeongdong gang. However, it wasn't clear whether the Jongno gang and the Dongdaemun gang were unified or affiliated in some way, as Lee Seung-man, the leader and ruler of the time, was actually involved in both of those gangs. We already know a little bit about the Jongno gang, so let's take a look more into the Myeongdong gang. Then follow it up with some information on the Dongdaemun gang. First, the Myeongdong gang. Now if my sources are accurate, then right after the war, Lee Hwa-ryong and Lee Song-soo, who were both born in North Korea, decided to stay in the south and started running the Myeongdong area. Now, according to reports during the Japanese colonial rule, the Myeongdong area was also known to be an area where a lot of Japanese would take up housing. However, after the Japanese left, Lee Hwa-ryong and Lee Song-soo took the helm of Myeongdong from the late 50s to early 60s. Lee Song-soo was also a feared man and was known as another great fighter in Korean history. The Myeongdong gang's biggest rival was just down the road and called the Dongdaemun gang. As mentioned earlier, the Dongdaemun gang had ties with the ruling Liberal Party and were well known for silencing political opponents. The faction was established in 1953 by Lee Jong-jae. No, not that Lee Jong-jae, obviously. And another gangster named Im Hwa-soo. This gang was notoriously known for creating terrorist attacks on a lot of protesters against the regime at the time. The beef between the two gangs, the Myeongdong gang and the Dongdaemun gang, started when Im Hwa-soo, second in command of the Dongdaemun faction, put a hit out on Myeongdong leader Lee Song-soo. Now this was without the permission of boss Lee Jong-jae, who was the head of the Dongdaemun faction. Lee Song-soo was brutally beaten outside his Busan residence and was left paralyzed. Another hit was put on him to maybe finish the job, but Lee Sung-soon survived that as well. This had actually troubled Lee Jong-jae, as he did not want to have any affiliation or anything to do with the Myeongdong gang. But unluckily for Lee Jong-jae, a hit was ordered from another Myeongdong boss named Lee Hwa-ryong. But Lee Jong-jae survived and Lee Hwa-ryong was arrested. Lee Hwa-ryong later retired from the gang business in the 1950s. Lee Jong-jae would eventually retire himself in the late 50s as well, and hand over his leadership of the Dongdaemun gang to Im Hwa-soo, the man he started the gang with. However, it would be Im Hwa-soo's decisions that would really damage the gang of Dongdaemun. His ill-fated decisions would start to see the fall of his faction, and actually many other factions around him at the time. Now, under the first president of South Korea, Lee Sung-man's Liberal Party, Im Hwa-soo constantly put out terrorist attacks on protesters, politicians, and etc. So much so that it was actually starting to gain the public attention. Im Hwa-soo's reckless behavior would show the government for what it really was, a corrupt and brutal regime. Frustration started to build up across the nation, and on April 18th, 1960, roughly 3,000 students from Korea University protested in front of the National Assembly building. It was supposed to be an uprising of the corruption within the government, but still wielding his power at the time, Im Hwa-soo sent a lot of his men down to the protesters to attack them. This eventually led to the very famous April Revolution, a protest against Im Sung-man's government. Again, I don't really want to get into the specifics of the revolution in this video. That's another video in itself, and it would cover a lot longer than what we're talking about today. But suffice to say, the protest, though bloody, with many dead and injured, eventually led to the downfall of Lee Sung-man as the leader of Korea. This also saw the collapse of many government gangs. Well, at least kept them out of the public eye. But for the gangsters that were eventually caught for being part of the corruption within the government, such as Lee Jong-jae, Im Hwa-soo, and Kim Do-han, well, they were tried, and luckily for them, escaped the death penalty for their crimes. Now, let's move on to the late 60s, to the 80s, and onwards. In the late 1960s through 1980s era of gangsters, it saw the return of the old style of gang, related to work rather than heavily involving themselves into politics. Street-level gang violence was on the rise again, and weapons such as knives, clubs, etc. were introduced into gang fights. We also saw two controversial governments take over and rule Korea, the Park Chung-hee and the Chon Do-hwan era. These two leaders that led the country from the 1960s to the 1970s were considered by many as running dictatorships rather than a democracy, which is what the public was yearning for after the leadership of Lee Sung-man. From my research, there were still close gang connections within the political scheme of things, but the country was more run in a military style rather than the style of a gang. Getting back to street-level gangs though. Though Lee Hwa-ryong, ex-leader of the Myeongdong faction, was out of the picture due to his retirement, Shin Sang-hyun, who was under Lee Hwa-ryong, now had leadership of the gang, and it was renamed the Shin Sang-sa gang. Shin Sang-hyun had the entirety of Iljiro, Myeongdong, and Chungmuro. These types of gangs were known to attack businesses for extortion, as well as adult entertainment, run clubs, and the start of connecting with other criminal global factions. This era seemed to mark the start of criminal families in Korea as well. Now, the two most notable Korean families in Korea were the Yang Un-lee family, run by Cho Yang-un, and the Sobang family, run by Kim Tae-jon. Another prominent gang was the Obi Dong-jae group, led by Lee Dong-jae. These gangs were not confined to the areas of Seoul anymore. They were spreading out throughout the country. In fact, there was an infamous fight between the Shin Sang-sa group and the Yang Un-lee family for control over Honam region located in the southwest of Korea, a war that was ultimately won by the Yang Un-lee family. According to records, Cho Yang-un and the Yang Un-lee family became one of the most powerful gangsters in South Korean history. Interestingly though, Yang also dabbled in acting as well. He even appeared in some well-known gangster movies at the time. Kim Tae-jon and the Sobang family rose through the underworld as forces to be reckoned with as well. During the 70s and the 80s, it was the Sobang family and the Yang-un family that ruled most of Korea. Kim Tae-jon became somewhat famous amongst Koreans. And just to jump ahead a little, in his funeral in 2013, it was covered throughout the media, and thousands of people, including celebrities, attended his funeral. Lee Dongjae, the founder of the OB Dongjae group, was also a big boss in the underground world, but couldn't outdo his rivals in Cho Yang-eun and Kim Tae-jon. Now, a hit was actually eventually put out on Lee Dongjae, but it would be one that he survived. And it led to Lee Dongjae to migrate to America. Now, this left Cho Yang-eun and Kim Tae-jon to be the two lead gangs in Korea. The two gangs were sworn enemies, and a lot of the gang's men were either injured or killed within the time of their power. Both Kim and Jo were in and out of jail for various crimes. Most notably for Kim was an infamous murder of a nightclub boss. This happened in 1986, which put him in jail for up to 5 years. But his term was suspended after being diagnosed with lung cancer. Though he managed to survive lung cancer, he was again arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison in 1992 for setting up a new criminal syndicate named Pomso Bangpa, which would go down as one of the most powerful gangs in South Korean history as well. In 2009, Cho publicly announced his retirement in the gang life, but only 1 year later went into hiding due to charges of loan application fraud. He was found in 2013 in the Philippines, coincidentally the same year that Kim Tae-jon passed away. During Cho's 3 years in the Philippines, he was still able to run his business. This time it was extorting money from a South Korean family who was also living in the Philippines. Now let's move into the 1990s. It's quite interesting to know there were no laws against gangs until the 1990s. Article 114 of the Korean criminal law stated that organized gangs along with members and founders of the gangs would be charged. This was the start of the government's plan to crack down on two major gangs and sub-gangs in Korea. Gangs at this point were known for running bars, karaoke bars, illegal businesses, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and assault. In 2011, the government declared war against organized crime, where in the first phase, 140 gang members were taken into custody and charged. And the second phase saw more than 800 gangsters apprehended, but only 175 were jailed. The last well-known gangster was Lee Kang-hwan, and his second in command, who I could just find the surname to be Han, who ran the Chilsung Pa or 7 Stars gang. His gang was known for extortion and fraud. Lee Kang-han was arrested in the late 80s, but I also have sources saying that he was also arrested in the 2010s for extorting a construction company. I'm not sure if Lee Kang-hwan was let out of jail between that time, but some sources suggest that he never actually left jail. Also, like many other gang bosses in 2013, Han was arrested as part of the war against crime. Han was closely watched in the year 2012 prior to his arrest, and it was known that he had plans to make his gang even bigger. Now, before we move on to our final era, a notable mention to the Korean Chinese gangs who took control of the west side of Seoul, as well as some areas in the Gyeonggi province. They were very feared in the 2000s and often involved themselves into very violent crimes. These gangs are predominantly comprised of ethnic Koreans who came from China, or Chosunjok, as they are known in Korean. Like I mentioned, they are known to be extremely violent and also did business in adult entertainment as well as extortion and the illegal importing and exporting of goods. One of the most well-known gangs in this area are the Snakeheads. These gangs have also been in and out of the news for quite some time and still operate to this day. Gangs are still active in today's society, but they are not as powerful as they used to be once upon a time. However, in recent years, the emergence of MZ gangsters, MZ standing for Millennials and Generation Z, started to spread through the news. Now, in December of 2023, South Korean police took down over 1,000 members of organized crime rings spanning across the country. This was part of another crackdown on crime here in South Korea. A large majority of the gang members were under the age of 30. Now, this was very different from the past, where a lot of the gang members were at least over the age of 30, or at least the leaders would be. As gangs in Korea have progressed, you have probably noticed the crimes differing from generation to generation. Koreans started from the rebellion against Japan to then becoming government-related gangs, but they all had to do with drugs, prostitution, adult entertainment, etc. But the gangs now seem to have a different trend. The trend in today's gang market still does reflect a little of the past, like prostitution, extortion, drugs, etc. But with technology playing a big part in society, voice phishing and illegal run gambling sites are now big money for MZ gangsters. Reports also suggest that these factions join forces compared to the past when a lot of gangs were against each other. Now, if you look really hard in Seoul, you could probably see the gangsters here and there. However, when compared to the past, there are no publicly high-profile bigwigs, no well-known factions, not much fear from the public, and as far as we know, no undue influence on the government. But one thing is for sure, they are still out there. And who knows what the next generation of gangsters in Korea is going to be like. Thank you for watching today's video. If this is something of interest to you, please leave a comment, like and subscribe to Kimchi Crime. I'm your host Walter Lee. See you next time.